So we're very pleased, obviously, to be hosting Nick Hanley, who's a professor at Glasgow, and who's kindly going to talk to us about his work on with several co-authors, but his work looking at how different metrics can be used in assessing biodiversity offsets, and how those different metrics or the implications of using those different metrics. So without further ado, sorry, no, one other comment, questions for the end. There's going to be plenty of time to ask questions, so if you could save them up to the end, that'd be ace. So and with that, I'll hand over to Nick.
Great, thanks very much, Ben, and let me know if my sound goes or you can't see the slides anymore, and I'll just keep talking if I don't hear anything from you, assuming that everything's fine. So first of all, thanks to Ben and Ian and the rest of the LEEP crew for inviting me to give this presentation. So this is joint work with the sort of usual team. Catherine Simpson, who's the lead author, Frans de Vries, Aberdeen, Paul Armsworth at Tennessee, Knoxville, Martin Dallamer at Leeds, and myself. So Paul and Martin are ecologists, myself, Kat, and Frans are environmental economists. And this work, I should say, is currently funded by the European Commission under a Horizon 2020 award, but we started working on this a few years ago, funded by the Leverhulme Trust. So I should mention them as well and thank them. So what I'm going to talk about today is a market for biodiversity offsets. And I think it would be a good idea to start by just outlining what exactly we mean by a biodiversity offset, and why they're an interesting and probably really important policy tool that's out there right now. So we know from the IPBES reports that across the world, a vast fraction of our land area has been significantly altered by development, largely driven by infrastructure and agricultural production. And we know that those land use changes have had, on the whole, pretty negative consequences for biodiversity. But it's really hard to think about undertaking actions which would stop that kind of land use change or reverse it, because that would get in the way of meeting some really important sustainable development goals, particularly in low-income countries. So there's a need, I think, to look for new tools which would allow governments to essentially find a better way of offsetting, to use that word, the implications of development for some measure of biodiversity. And we need those tools to be ecologically effective. And as economists, we'd also like them to be cost effective. And markets for biodiversity offsets are one such approach. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Now, offsets are sort of one part of what's called a mitigation hierarchy. So there's typically thought of as a number of steps that you would take before you would seek to offset the negative impacts of development on some aspect of biodiversity. So minimizing, avoiding, and restoring. But for many kinds of development, those kinds of actions aren't going to be feasible. And so we need to think about something extra, and that something extra is going to be offsetting. Now, this is very relevant in the UK, where we are talking today, simply because of the Environment Act 2021, which has essentially created this new regulated environmental market by putting a requirement on local planning authorities to make sure that developers offset the impacts of their actions on a measure of biodiversity. And where developers, so I'm thinking mainly of housing developers here, but we could also think about people who are constructing new public transport or new roads. where developers need to offset their impact and they can't do that on site, then the Environment Act has allowed them to essentially go ahead and purchase offset credits, which are produced elsewhere in space. So I might undertake an action in one location, and that is going to allow me to, and I'm going to offset the biodiversity impact of that by undertaking an offset somewhere else. And this didn't come out of nowhere. We had a pilot offsetting scheme back in 2012, 2014, which didn't work out so well. And we also have to think about the context of the 25-year environment plan, 2018, basically setting out the need for new houses, but also the need to do something to offset the impact of those new houses on biodiversity. Now, it's interesting. We started thinking about offset markets maybe 5 years ago, and it seemed to us then that whilst many aspects of economic incentives for conservation have been pretty thoroughly investigated by economists, like conservation auctions, for example, there really wasn't much stuff done in economics about offsetting. There was a lot of research in the ecological and conservation science communities, and they were looking at particularly what's the evidence that offsetting is effective, what's the evidence on how long it takes to generate an offsetting set of actions, or for those actions to deliver ecological gains that might offset the negative impact of a development. But there really wasn't much work being done on the economics of these programs. And so that's one of the reasons we got interested in. And today I'm going to talk most about the currency or the metric in which a biodiversity market might operate. And rather early on, people like Jeff Heal and Joe Bull from Economics and Ecology were suggesting that the choice of the metric is going to be probably one of the most important things that the regulator does in establishing the rules of this created market. So, there's a bunch of ecological work on the impacts of alternative metrics, but really not much economic work that's quantitative, and certainly none that we could find within the context of a market for offset credits. So that's essentially where we're going to be walking towards in this work here. So what do I mean by an offset market? I mean a situation where we've got multiple buyers and sellers interacting together. And I guess the easiest way to think about this is to think about the buyers as being house builders, developers, who by law are going to be required to offset some measurable impact of their new housing development on some indicator of biodiversity. And the way they can do that is by buying credits. And those credits are going to be supplied by land managers who are going to freely choose to change land management in a way which increases some measure of biodiversity. And then an offset bank or regulator is going to validate that process and say, okay, that earns you X number of credits. And then those X number of credits can be sold to the developer. So the developer as on the demand side, and the land manager on the supply side may be considerably separated in space. So the developer might be in Devon and the landowner might be in Cornwall. But the idea is by establishing an appropriate exchange rate between sellers and buyers, we can, in theory, and I guess that's an important thing to say, in theory, achieve either no net loss of some biodiversity metric, let's say species abundance for a particular species, or a net gain in that same metric at lowest cost. So essentially this market is going to generate a price for units of biodiversity. Developers have to buy credits. Landowners, by changing their land management, are going to be able to supply those credits, and the market is going to match suppliers with demanders. And if we get it right, that market's going to clear, and at the equilibrium price, we'll find that we've actually got a least cost solution to delivering that no net loss of biodiversity. So that's the idea, the basic idea. And what we're trying to do is to say, well, how does changing the rules of the market change how it performs? I guess that's how you would summarize what we're trying to do here. So, as I mentioned earlier, we've been working on this problem for a while now, and I thought it would be useful to just summarize briefly the 3 papers we've already published, because it kind of sets the background for the new paper that I'm going to mainly talk about today. So the first thing that we published was, back in 2019 now in the Journal of Applied Ecology, was a paper where we said, well, biodiversity offset markets aren't unique in being a regulated, created market which provides an economic incentive for agents to improve their environmental performance or for society to achieve some environmental target. And you know, the most obvious example of markets which do that are tradable pollution markets. So markets in pollution credits, whether it's the EU ETS or earlier on in time sulfur trading in the US between power stations. And we've really got a lot of experience now in globally in, you know, what is it that determines the performance of these kinds of cap and trade markets. And so in our first paper, we're asking the question, well, is there something you can learn from pollution markets that would help us design better a biodiversity offset market? And in the paper, we end up identifying 4 aspects of market design, which we think seem to be important if we think about pollution permits. And the first one of those is the trading ratio. So that's if I want to increase my emissions of pollution at this location, how many permits do I need to buy from a seller at some other location if we're thinking about a non-uniformly mixed pollutant? And, you know, back in the 70s and 80s, there were lots of papers which tried to estimate these trading ratios or transfer coefficients, as they were called, from things like air quality models or water quality models, to basically try and capture what is the difference across space in the impacts that firms, in this case, have on some measure of air quality or water quality. And it seemed to us that within a biodiversity offset market, you've got exactly the same problem, because you're trying to somehow capture the difference that a developer might have on a measure of biodiversity in one location relative to a potential supplier of offset credits who's going to be increasing the conservation of land in some other location. So what we'd really like to know about is what's the kind of exchange rate between actions which reduce biodiversity in one location and actions which increase biodiversity at some other location. So that trading ratio is going to be really important. The second aspect we talked about was the currency or the metric that I'm going to come back to. And we talked about, you know, lessons learned being that this should be simple and measurable and standardized. We thought about market scale. How big should the permit market be? And I'll show you some results on that in a minute. And then finally, we thought about issues to do with regulation of the market, such as monitoring and enforcement. So that paper just said, well, you know, what are the lessons we can learn and from the tradable pollution permit market, and how might we implement some of those lessons within a market for biodiversity offsets? But what we really wanted to do next was then to say, okay, well, let's see if we can test those out, or some of those market design aspects out within an actual simulated, that's a ridiculous thing to say, within a simulated biodiversity offset market. And so this first paper, which bizarrely only just came out in Land Economics, basically said, okay, first of all, let's look at what is it we're trading in. And in that specific paper, we're looking at which species we use as a metric. And secondly, ask the question, how does the geographic scale of the market affect the ecological outcomes and the economic outcomes? And in all of these empirical papers I'm describing today, we're using essentially the same ecological economic modeling setup, where we have, and I'll talk about this in more detail later, but just to give you the brief highlights, we have an ecological model that's relating changes in land use to some biodiversity indicator. And then we have an economic model, which is talking about how land managers would optimally allocate their land between, in this case, 3 different land uses. That's agriculture, conservation, or housing development. And in this first paper, the case study that we use is the Tees Valley. And just to pick out a couple of highlights from what we found there, we found that particularly that which bird we chose as our metric had quite a noticeable impact on where development occurred, on where offsets were created, on the amount of development that occurs, on the level of trade, and on the market equilibrium price. And we also found that what we call the off-market ecological impacts from trading are considerable. So by off-market, I mean, for example, if we say the metric of our biodiversity credits is a particular bird like the lapwing, the off-market impacts would be ecological impacts as a result of the operation of the market on other birds. And we found those were considerable. In terms of market size, we found that bigger regions were beneficial for developers, basically. They allowed them to make bigger profits. Smaller planning regions constrained developers' ability to access the cheapest offsets, and that put a downward pressure on development. And the overall conclusion that came out of this paper was that your optimal design of a biodiversity market would really depend on whether you put more weight on the ecological performance of the market or on the economic performance of the market, that these two things didn't necessarily go together. So that was the first thing we did. And then we took the same modeling setup, moved it north a couple 100 miles to the Forth Valley in central Scotland, and switched our focus away from simply trying to achieve no net loss in biodiversity to something a bit more ambitious, which is a net gain in biodiversity. And we're particularly interested in what happens to the market when you increase the amount of net gain that we're aiming for. And we're interested in, well, what's going to happen to the equilibrium price and quantity of offsets as we wind up the net gain requirement? What's going to happen to the amount of housing development as we wind up the net gain requirement? And what are going to be the ecological effects, both within the market and outside the market? And how are they going to vary across space? So, space is really important here. Brett and Ian have been saying that for a very long time now, and hopefully in these results you'll see that space really matters. So one interesting thing in that paper, which is in this relatively new journal, Q Open, is that we have a theory model where we ask the question, as you increase the net gain requirement, so that means if a development goes ahead, rather than having a zero change in the biodiversity indicator, we want a positive change. And that positive change could be plus 10%, or plus 25%. You could just think of the abundance of a species or how many grid squares it's counted in. And the interesting result we got out of the theory model was that actually, as you increase this net gain target, the impact on the equilibrium price and quantity is actually ambiguous. And it actually depends on the elasticity of demand around the equilibrium. And that's because there's two things going on. You know, as we increase the net gain requirement, that means developers are essentially having to buy more credits to build on a given location. But what's also happening, of course, is that's changing at the margin decisions over whether to keep land as agricultural land or convert it to a biodiversity credit or convert it to development. And those two things together are working in opposite directions. And so what we found empirically that was actually, and you know, this was kind of surprising but interesting, that the market clearing price, and here we're using a species as the metric, so it's a bird called a lapwing. The market clearing price and the number of credits bought and sold was actually greatest under a no net loss target, and lowest under the highest net gain target. So that was kind of interesting. As the net gain target is cranked up, the equilibrium price of permits falls, and the equilibrium quantity bought and sold falls as well. We also find that as we crank up this net gain requirement, the amount of land parcels that are developed decreases. And I guess that's not so surprising. We're basically saying to develop, you're now having to more than offset your biodiversity impact, your negative biodiversity impact. So that was kind of interesting, I think. And then there's this new paper, which just got accepted in conservation biology, I'm happy to say. We're taking our attention back to the metric. So we looked at that briefly in the land economics paper, but in this paper, it's going to be our main focus. And we're going to ask the question, how does the choice of the offset metric, the currency in which the market runs, how does this affect both ecological outcomes and economic outcomes at the landscape scale? So let's get wired into this. So we base this, and I'll say more about it in a minute, on our Forth Valley case study area. And we set up a conceptual framework where every grid square is essentially, let's think about them as a landowner. And that landowner can allocate their land into 3 different uses. So the first use is agriculture. The second use is new housing. And the third use is conservation. And if I allocate it from agriculture to conservation, I'm going to earn an offset credit. And the amount of credits I earn is going to depend on essentially the ecological potential of my site, given the metric I choose, if we're using a species metric. And so essentially, we've got the same setup as we had before. The supply side of the market is farmers who are deciding to switch from agriculture to conservation land use. And I'll be clear what that is in a minute, the conservation land use. And then on the demand side, you can think of them as house builders. And we observe that there's a lot of heterogeneity across space here in the rents from farming, so the profits you can make from farming, but also in the implicit rent of any grid square in terms of its return for new housing. So we expect that the minimum supply price for the offsets created, and thus the supply of offsets, to vary across space due to variations in these agricultural rents. So we already saw in that picture there that there's a very large variation in agricultural rents, so due to underlying differences in soil quality, for example. So because of that, each farmer, each grid square is going to demand less of a price. It's going to demand a variable return to switch from farming to supplying an offset. So if I'm operating on land with very high agricultural rents, I'm going to need to be offered a much higher offset price to decide to switch my land from agriculture to conservation. We also expect the maximum demand price for offsets to vary across space, and that's simply because house prices vary across space, as is true everywhere. And finally, a third source of heterogeneity here is going to be the ecological potential of agricultural land to give us additional units of biodiversity. So again, going back to that picture, we're not expecting that for all of those grid squares, currently down to agriculture, that we get the same increase in biodiversity from switching from farming to conservation. We're expecting to get a different return. So as we've talked about it, that ecological productivity of land varies across space is how we think about it. So that's what we expect. Let me tell you a little bit more about the model. So as I said, it's an integrated ecological economic model. So like the work that Paul and I did about 10 years ago in the Peak District, we have a statistical ecological model, which is a species abundance model, which is essentially embedded in an economic decision-making model. So in our ReLU project, that economic decision-making model was a farm level optimization in which wasn't spatially explicit. In this new work here, it's an agent-based model. It runs in Stata, and it's very spatially explicit. And then both the ecological model outputs from the ecological model and outputs from the economic model, we can display spatially using GIS. So these are the three pieces that we put together to make this work. And what are we going to be, what's the policy we're going to be simulating here? So each simulation is going to use one policy target and one metric. And the policy target here is going to be no net loss. So we're not talking about net gain. We could do, but we're not. We're talking about no net loss. And it's no net loss either of a single habitat. So that's going to be low intensity grassland, or it's going to be no net loss of a single species. And we compared two species who are subject to population decline across the whole of the UK at the moment. Very unfortunately, the curlew on the right there with the long beak, and the lapwing on the left. So we're basically going to say, how would the functioning of the market change if the currency, the thing people are trading in, is habitat units versus species units? And how does the performance of the market in species units vary according to which species we pick? So we just have two here. Some of you may know we've also done this stuff for oyster catchers. So the ecological model we're using, well, I'll come back to the data sets in a minute, but what we're doing here is we're basically saying, how does land use change at the parcel level, and our parcels are 1 kilometer grid squares? How does land use change affect the abundance of a specific species as a function of the land use characteristics in that parcel and land use characteristics around that parcel? And so that's what we're trying to do. And we're trying to do that because we need, or the regulator would need, that kind of model to know how many credits to award a farmer in a specific location for undertaking a specific action, if our market has a metric which is species. So I need to know if Farmer Joe undertakes this land use change on his farm, how many extra curlews does that result in? compare that to farmer Emma in a different location. She undertakes the same land use change. How many extra curlews does that generate? So that's essentially one thing the model is doing for us. The other thing the model is doing for us, it's saying if house builder decides to apply to build houses in a specific location, what's the predicted loss of either curlews or lapwings? So we're using the ecological model to do both of those things. And then the agent-based model, which is running in Stata, is saying, okay, now for each of these farmers, so every kilometer grid square is a farmer in our setup, what would their optimal decision be about whether to supply offsets or not, or whether to allow house building to happen or not, as a function of the maximum willingness to pay for offsets and the minimum supply price. And if we rank those in terms of minimum willingness to pay to the highest value of willingness, minimum willingness to accept to the highest value of willingness to accept, we'll trace out a supply curve. And if we do the same for the demand curve, we can arrive at a function like this. So these are empirically estimated from our model. That's going to show us the equilibrium price. And then we can figure out, well, what happens to that equilibrium price? Who's in as a seller? Who's in as a buyer? Where do the new houses get built? Where do the biodiversity credits get produced? And the model essentially matches buyers and sellers until all potential gains from trade are exhausted. So it's a bit like the tradable permit market models that people like Scott Atkinson put together in the mid-80s, in the sense that we're assuming that all trades that are profitable go through. And we're thinking of an offset bank as an institution that would help that process, or a Valrasian auctioneer, if you prefer. And then the spatial analysis in ArcGIS is just going to store the data that we start with to estimate the model, but it's also going to display the outputs in terms of, where do the new houses get built, where do the offset supply sites locate, and where are there gains and losses in, for example, in this case, curlews. So that's how it's all going to work. Just very briefly on the data, we've got 5 spatially referenced data sets that will be very familiar to most of you. So we've got the BTO breeding bird survey for the whole of the east of the UK. That's what we estimate the ecological model on. That's also using inputs from CH land cover and land cover plus crop maps. It's also using, so it's using those 2 data sets. In terms of the agent-based model, we're then combining that with current land use matched with gross margin data, which gives us the net benefits for any crop in any location. We weight agricultural profits according to an index of soil fertility. And then finally, for housing values, we have data from HM Land Registry. So putting that data set together for these 2 sites was quite a bit of work. So just very briefly, where are we reporting this for? This is where I live, really. So we're looking at this this imagined market operating within the, you could think of it as the catchment of the River Forth, but it's a bit bigger than that. But the grayed out area on the map is our market. So our biodiversity offset suppliers are all located in this space, and our biodiversity offset demanders are all located in this space. There's no trading permitted inside or outside of these boundaries, only inside these boundaries. So that gives us 8,300 land parcels that we have to have in the agent-based model. So just before I go to some results, let's think about the intuition here. And as I mentioned a few slides ago now, what we're trying to do is compare a biodiversity offset market where the metric, the currency, is habitats, with a biodiversity offset market where the currency, the metric, is species. So if we have habitats, and our focus habitat is going to be low intensity grassland, then what would we imagine might happen? Well, first of all, we might imagine that land parcels with the highest predicted development rent, most profitable for housing, will be developed first, and that parcels that offer the highest agricultural rents are more likely to remain as farmland. Parcels with the lowest development rents and the lowest agricultural rents are more likely to become potential offset supply sites. And therefore, what we're interested in is the spatial correlation between development rents and species abundance on restored land parcels. Now, if we found that there was a negative correlation between development rent and species abundance, then a policy target which focuses solely on habitat as the metric could actually benefit the species. But we'd get the opposite result where that correlation was positive. So our prediction might be then that the outcome in terms of a species abundance from having a habitat trading metric is going to depend on this empirical relationship between development rents and species abundance in our offset market. And so, you can draw a picture of that, which is all I've done there. And that's really important. So the sign of the correlation is going to basically say whether trading in habitats is going to lead to a net gain in species overall or to a decline in species. Okay, if we have a species-based metric, so this is going to be based on one of our two birds, then land parcels now have an ecological weighting based on their predictability from our ecological model to support the species as specified in the policy target, in contrast to the habitat metric case. So we're going to weight each land parcel according to its ecological potential to supply us with more lapwings or more curlews. And the overall abundance of the target species should not change because we've got a no net loss rule for that species. But the spatial distribution of that species is likely to change as a result of exchanging credits. And we might also see some non-zero sum changes to our area of focus habitat. So for us, if you remember, that's low intensity grassland. So that might go down or it might go up. And also having a metric that focuses on one species, of course, gives you no guarantee about what happens to the off-market species, the non-target species. So if our metric is curlew, we don't really know what's going to happen to lapwing. And if our metric's lapwing, we don't really know what's going to happen to curlew. So there's not a lot of intuition there, really. So let me move on to some results. And if anybody's interested, we're very happy to send you the paper. It's on our website at the moment. So firstly, thinking about the habitat metric. So this is where we have now an offset market where the currency is hectares of low intensity grassland. So for every hectare of low intensity grassland you destroy, you have to pay a farmer somewhere else to create a new hectare. And what we see from that is no net loss in grassland. Well, that's by design, but we get a really big decline in both of our focus species, both lapwing and curlews. And the reason that's happening is because essentially we've got a positive correlation between development rents and species abundance. And what that means is our intuition led us to predict that would result in a habitat-based metric driving down species numbers, and that's exactly what we see. Moreover, the agricultural parcels with the lowest rents that most benefit lapwing and curlew are the same parcels that are more likely to be developed for housing than restored to grass and offsets. So in this case study area, it looks like having a metric which is habitat is not good news if you're a bird. On the other hand, if you're a bird, then having a species metric is a great idea if you are the species that defines the metric. we certainly get changes in the spatial distribution of our species. So we get no net loss across the whole area, but we see some patches that gain curlew or lapwing, and some patches that lose curlew or lapwing, but we have no overall change. And I can perhaps show you that more clearly in a picture. So if we want to compare these metrics, what we find is that the landscape scale outcomes are substantially different depending on which metric we choose. So with the grassland metric, so that's a habitat metric, we get roughly no net loss of grassland. But as I already mentioned, we get this big loss of lapwings and we get this big loss of curlews. When lapwings are the metric, we actually get a net loss of grassland. We get no net loss of lapwings, but we do lose more curlews than we gain. When curlews are the metric, we get no net loss of curlews. We get a reduction in lapwings, and we get a large loss in grassland. So the basic conclusion here is, depending on our choice of metric or currency from the offset market, we're seeing very substantial off-market impacts in terms of aspects of biodiversity that we might care about. So I think I need to kind of bring things to a conclusion here. I was going to show you some extra results we have on paying for results, but I ran out of time. So let me just move to some conclusions on this stuff. The choice of metric for biodiversity offset trading is crucial, it turns out, to the ecological and the economic outcomes of the market. And the initial starting conditions of where our species are layered over the variation in agricultural rents and development rents results in really different landscape scale outcomes depending on which metric we choose. And so you could say it's heterogeneity in the initial species distribution across the landscape, which is, importantly driving these results. If we wish to secure the most ecologically beneficial design of an offsets policy, whether that's based on habitats or species or some other metric like DEFRA's metric 3.0, we need to understand the economic decision processes of the landowners. And in a very crude way, that's what our agent-based model is doing. It's basically saying every farmer, every land manager in this area, make an economically rational choice between these three mutually exclusive uses of your land. Carry on farming, build houses, create offset credits. And we do find also that with this market, we're not delivering the biggest incentives for conserving and enhancing the most ecologically beneficial sites. Because some of those most ecologically beneficial sites are essentially being lost to development because house builders can make a big enough profit to still make it attractive to build on that site, even though they got to buy lots of credits. So we couldn't conclude from this work that offset markets alone are going to protect our most ecologically valuable sites. But I guess we never assumed that anyway, or at least I hope nobody assumed that. Where are we going to now? So here's a lovely picture of a lapwing in a grassland field. We're going to a bigger case study region, which is the whole of the northeast of England. And rather than having it the case that you only generate offset credits by switching agricultural land use to one specific form of land management, which is low intensity grassland, we want to try and add some extra detail there. So for example, thinking about peatland restoration in the uplands, or changing the management of grassland in the lowlands, or indeed in both of our case study sites, salt marsh restoration at the coastal margins. And we do see very strong focus of offset sites for our oyster catchers around the coast. So including restoration cost data is going to be really important here, because right now, the only cost that offset suppliers face is the opportunity cost of giving up on agricultural production. So I think I'll leave it there, Ben. I was going to run through some stuff on paying for outcomes, but I ran out of time. So let me stop sharing.
Thank you very much for that really interesting talk, Nick. I think that means, yeah, and so some kind of virtual applause from the audiences there as well. I think that means that we've got about kind of a bit over 10 minutes for kind of any questions. If people want to come in on that at all. I guess maybe raise your hand might be the easiest way to, as in like the virtual. Oh, and we've got some question, at least one question in the chat. So Emma Gardner, I mean, do you want to feel free to kind of unmute and maybe ask it?
Yeah, I can do. Yeah. So just how are you engaging with ethics in all of this trading? Because you had an analogy to pollution, but biodiversity is not analogous to pollution because this is trading the livelihoods of living beings. So it's more like a slave trading analogy even than pollution, because these are living beings that actually don't have any representation in this decision-making process. So how are you getting towards the ethics of this whole thing? Or is that something you're doing later?
I should just say, by the way, that Kat has joined us on the call. I didn't realize she was there. So she's the modeling genius behind all of this. She can answer all the hard modeling questions. So to answer your question, what we're saying is biodiversity offset creation a better way of conserving biodiversity than either no policy or some alternative policy? So if we accept that, thinking about the UK, just for example, that new houses will be built, new roads will be created, new public transport links will be created, and that will result in a negative impact on some metric of biodiversity at that location. What we're saying is, what's the best way of overall offsetting that impact? And this is argument out there that if you can somehow establish an economic incentive for landowners to increase biodiversity conservation, that's going to be better than, for example, a regulatory approach. So that's all we're doing. We're saying, given that these kind of negative impacts on biodiversity will happen from development, what's the best way of offsetting them? And how does the consequence of offsetting vary according to how you design this market? But you're right. I mean, there are many complications that mean that a biodiversity offset market is not exactly like a pollution trading market. But the really important similarity is both of these are environmental markets that the government has created to try and achieve some environmental target.
Nick, if I can just add something in there, it's not research that we're working on specifically, Emma, but EJ Milner-Gullen's group at Oxford are doing a lot of work on the social impacts of biodiversity offsetting. So they're looking at this mainly in a developing country context, but how, if you're pursuing offset markets, how if you're losing access to biodiversity locally, how it's going to affect sort of small scale villages and rural communities if then that biodiversity is being transferred elsewhere. So there are other research groups that are beginning to look at this and start to think about it in that way, but it's not something that we specifically do within our work.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on that, we published a paper about 2 years ago in Uganda looking at biodiversity offsets for hydroelectric schemes, and that's looking at what is it the local communities want in an offset. Okay, who's next?
I think we're going to go to Jetta. I'm sorry if I've pronounced your name incorrectly.
Jetta.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you.
I think Jetta is nicer, maybe.
And it sounds like an airplane or something.
It
like
does,
that.
yeah.
Anyway, thank you, Nick, for a very nice presentation. I was wondering a few things. One was in your species abundance model, because that's one of the things we have been looking into in Denmark with the ecologists, and getting solid knowledge is challenging. So the first one is how solid is this species abundance model in terms of predicting the probability of species change. And that also leads me to the other question, which is that when you said that the ecologically most valuable sites are obviously not going to be chosen because they're difficult for them to compete with the high land prices, then I was wondering, and that it therefore depends a lot on the correlation between the species presence and the value of the land. Then how have you any idea how transferable this is? And because that must depend on the choice of the species, or whether you have considered using an index instead that could capture ecological variance better than a single species.
Yeah. Kat, do you want to take that point about the ecological model?
Yeah, so yes, so I worked with Martin Dalamer, our ecologist at Leeds. So I would say in terms of what we needed to do, it's satisfactory. So it's been through peer review at Conservation Biology and it's been accepted. It's definitely not the most cutting edge way that we could do this. So going forward, I'd definitely like to look at modelling some more spatial heterogeneity in there, which we don't capture at the moment. We also don't have any temporal changes in it. So it's good enough, but it could definitely be better. But if you'd like us to chat more about it, then I could send you the detail of what we've done and things. I'm happy to share that with you.
Yeah, it was just out of curiosity. It was not a critique of any sort.
Yeah.
Just, yeah.
And on the second part, Jette, we haven't actually yet tried to do a market that's where the currency is a sort of community indicator. That's on our to-do list, but we haven't done it yet.
We did a very basic version where we had just the abundance of the 3 species in the model, but all we found was that oyster catchers just ended up driving everything because their predictive distributions were just so much higher along the coast and at the salt marshes that's all we ended up offsetting, and we just got big declines in lapwing and curlew.
Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot that.
I think Matthew is up next.
Yeah, thank you. A really exciting paper. I've got loads of questions, but I'll try and restrict it. Who gets to play in this? It seems like the way you've set it up, it's UK-based developers on the demand side and largely UK farmers on the supply side. But UK farmers could supply offsets to a global market. And so why would they restrict themselves just to what you can find on the demand side from domestic developers? And then I suppose that there is one more question I have to ask, because farmers are asking me all the time about it, is how long is the offset going to be offset for?
Yeah.
And what's the payment structure? Is it a one-off payment and the land use management is changed for all eternity, or is it a subscription model, or is it? Yeah.
So those are 2 great questions. So the first question, you know, the rules of the market that we have set are there's no trading outside of the geographic boundaries of the market. And so at the moment, our farmers cannot sell credits outside those geographic boundaries. And we've drawn them round. You could think of it as the catchment. What's interesting is that the recent report that FTech led on for the UK DEFRA on how would an offset market work in England, they're basically making the assumption that all the trades would have to be within local planning areas, which is a much smaller spatial unit than we've been messing around with. And the ecologists get nervous the bigger the spatial scale of the market. And in the land economics paper, we kind of demonstrate that they're getting nervous for a really good reason. Developers on the whole would vote for a bigger market. Ecologists would vote for a smaller market, I think would be a crude way of summarizing it. But thank you for that question.
And sorry, can I just push, how long is it offset?
Yeah. So we haven't talked to farmers about this at all. That's going to be in our next project if it gets funded. But yeah, in principle, these are conservation easements. So people are giving up the production rights forever.
Yeah, so very difficult kind of practicalities there. Tom, I think, yeah.
So yeah, thanks a lot for that, Nick. Really, really interesting, especially seeing all of those different works put together like that. My question actually sort of follows on very nicely from the answer to your last question. From what I've seen, you've sort of considered that agricultural land will necessarily be transformed into habitat, but I'm guessing not yet, but do you think in the future your models could potentially consider systems like agroforestry that have the potential to deliver both production and biodiversity benefits? Because when we're talking with farmers, they're often sort of saying that they're interested in agroforestry, but it's kind of that capital to get it off the ground. And this is purely me potentially overthinking things, but it's a case of, well, if you can bring agroforestry and other sort of conservation oriented or conservation beneficial farming systems into an offset framework, then you could potentially help them with some of that upfront cost of transforming the whole food system. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
No, that's a really interesting point, and we under the new LEEPout project that we're working on, which is a kind of land sharing versus land sparing thing, but focused on woodland biodiversity. It should be possible to extend sort of the sort of choice set for the farmer from simply, if you want to earn a credit, you have to switch whatever you're doing to low intensity grassland to something a bit more nuanced. And one of those options could be create agroforestry, because the key, well, we need to know two things about that. We need to know, like, well, what does that cost? But crucially, we need to know what does that deliver for whatever the biodiversity metric is. So the stuff that another Tom, who's the postdoc on this new LEEPout project, what he'll be doing should tell us something about that delivery for the kinds of birds, well, for different kinds of birds, but for birds anyway. We haven't moved away from birds as the biodiversity metric, as a species-based metric yet. But yeah, no, that's a really good idea, and it's something that we are definitely planning to do.
Well, do get in touch if you want any stuff on inverts, because we've done a little bit on agroforestry impacts on inverts at Reading.
Okay. Yeah, no, that Kat will remember that, won't you, Kat?
And I think with that, we're on to a kind of final question, which will come from Matt here. I just wanted to check, Nick, sorry, and kind of following on from Tom's point, there is, I assume, no kind of leakage effects accounted for in this, right? As in, you simply replace farming, you get some habitat, and the fact that we have to import a bunch of food is, I assume, ignored. That is it. Not that that's a criticism of the general literature, not specifically your paper. I just wanted to check.
Absolutely. No, I mean, in this new LEEPout project, this land sharing versus land sparing thing, we absolutely will be dealing with that point. But in the current work, we absolutely ignore it. Yeah,
that makes sense. But this is so Mattia, do you want to just ask the last one?
Yeah, thank you very much for the brilliant presentation. My question revolves more towards the mitigation hierarchy that you mentioned at the start. And obviously the work mostly focused on offsets, But do you think that there's a potential if you set up a regulatory framework based on mitigation hierarchy, where the offset are obviously like the last step?
Yeah.
Do you think there could be a potential to see this mismatch between the different objectives depending on the metric reduced?
Well, that's a really nice suggestion. I hadn't thought of that. Kat, do you want to say something about that?
It's not something I've thought about in great detail at the moment, Mattia. Yeah, I don't know if Nick, I guess whenever I presented this to ecologists, I always stress that I still see this as the final step, and we should always be focusing on avoidance where possible. I know, so Joseph Bull at Kent, he's planning on started to work on this and just focusing more back on the initial stages of mitigation hierarchy. But I haven't got much more myself to add at the moment.
But what would be really useful is if you could send us a wee proposal for what you might like us to look at, and then we could think about it.
No, that's something that really interests me. So
yeah, write it down and send it to us. That would be great.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks.
So I guess, yeah, with that, it just kind of leaves us to say kind of final thank you to Nick, and thanks to everyone that came along as well. We'll have EIL Frank giving a presentation. I want to say it's the 7th of April. It's certainly the first Thursday of the month in April, and that'll be at the more usual time of 4 till 5. But anyway, yes, thanks very much to Nick for a really interesting talk, and obviously also to Kat for kind of stepping in and answering some of those questions as well. So yeah, thank you very much.